Hand it over, Claire. That box is estate property and you know it. But I didn't hand it over. And I didn't argue. I just closed both hands around the box and let the whole chapel watch me do it. My grandmother had been in the ground for 40 minutes. The oak was still cold from the drive to the cemetery and back, and my mother stood up from the front pew in her good black dress and crossed the 4 steps to my seat with her hand already out, loud enough for every person at that funeral to hear. "Whatever she hid in there, it belongs to all of us. Give it to me. Now." Everyone braced for me to fold. To cry, to apologize, to hand a grieving mother the box and keep the peace. The way I'd kept the peace my entire life. Instead, I looked up at her, and I said the only thing that could stop her. "Then let's open it right here, Mom, in front of everyone. I think Grandma would have wanted an audience for this." Now, I know how that sounds. The quiet granddaughter, the one who never made a scene, telling her own mother to bring it on at a funeral. But here's what my mother didn't know. My grandmother had that box made 40 years ago, and she spent the last years of her life, the years my mother couldn't be bothered to drive across town, quietly turning it into something. When my family finally pried it open, they were going to find what looked like a pile of worthless old recipe cards. And they were going to laugh. They had no idea they were looking at the most carefully laid plan of an 81-year-old woman's life, and that the only person alive who could read it was me. My name is Claire Ellison, and to understand what was really in that box, I have to take you back 22 years to a step stool in my grandmother's kitchen. Now, the kitchen. I was 12 years old, standing on a yellow step stool in my grandmother's kitchen, and she was teaching me to make her apple cake. My grandmother's name was Vera. Her kitchen was the warmest room in any house I have ever been in, before or since. It smelled of cinnamon and coffee, and the particular clean smell of an old woman who ironed her dish towels. There was a windowsill full of herbs in coffee cans, and a canister of flour with a hand-painted daisy on it, and next to the flour, a small oak recipe box with a brass latch that clicked when you pressed it. That day, we were making the apple cake, and I remember every part of it, the way you remember the things you didn't know were important until much later. I remember the flour on her forearms. I remember that she never measured anything. She'd pour salt into her palm and look at it and know. I remember she let me crack the eggs, and one of them got shell in the bowl, and she didn't sigh or take over. She just showed me how to lift it out with a bigger piece of shell, patient as anything, like we had all the time in the world. In my mother's kitchen, a mistake was a verdict. In Vera's kitchen, a mistake was just a step. And when the cake was in the oven, she pulled a card out of that little oak recipe box and set it on the counter in front of me. "This one's yours now," she said. "You're old enough to be trusted with it." It was the apple cake, written in her small, careful hand, butter-stained at one corner from 100 bakings. I held it like she'd handed me the deed to a kingdom. I was 12, and no one had ever told me I was old enough to be trusted with anything. And then she said the thing I didn't understand for 22 years. She was wiping her hands on her apron, and she got a look on her face, far away and a little amused, like she was telling a joke whose punchline wouldn't land for decades. "Your grandfather had 2 of these boxes made," she said, "the year we married. There was a carpenter in town, old Mr. Pardo, and a big oak came down in a storm that spring, and your grandfather had him make 2 boxes out of the same tree. Twins." She tapped the recipe box on the counter. Click, click. "This one's for the recipes." Then she looked at me for a long moment, deciding something I couldn't see. "The other one's for the things that matter more than recipes. You'll know it when you see it, and you'll know what to do about it." I was 12. I thought she meant jewelry or old letters or the boring grown-up things that live in the bottoms of closets. I said, "Okay, Grandma, can we frost the cake now?" And she laughed, and we frosted the cake. And I did not think about that second box again for 22 years. I want you to hold on to that carpenter and that single oak tree, because it matters more than anything. If you've ever been the one who showed up, who visited, who answered the phone, who sat with them at the end while everyone else was too busy, hit like and subscribe and tell me in the comments who you showed up for. There's a new confession here every day, and I like knowing who's out there. Let me tell you about my family, so you understand the room I was sitting in when my mother reached for that box. My mother, Carol, is the kind of woman who has never once in her life been in a room without calculating her position in it. Where she sits, who she outranks, what's owed to her. She is not a monster. I want to be fair, because the truth is more useful than a villain. She is a frightened woman who decided a long time ago that love was a finite resource, and you had to grab your share before someone else took it. She spent my whole childhood grabbing. I'll give you one example of my mother, and then you'll have her. When I was 16, I saved up and bought her a scarf for Christmas. Real silk. It took me 2 months of babysitting. She opened it, held it up, said, "Oh, how sweet," and set it down. Then she opened Grant's gift, which was a gas station candle he'd bought on the way over, and she teared up and said he always knew exactly what she needed. That's my mother. It was never about the gift. It was about who she'd already decided to love more, and everything after just got sorted into that. My brother Grant is 4 years older than me, and Grant learned at our mother's knee. Grant is charming in the particular way of a man who has never once had to be anything else, because charm always worked, so why develop anything underneath it? He calls when he needs something. He shows up to family events 40 minutes late with a store-bought pie, and somehow makes you feel like the pie is a personal gift he's bestowing on you. My mother thinks the sun rises and sets on Grant. Grant has always known it, and he built an entire life on the knowing. A life of soft landings and other people's forgiveness. I don't fully blame him. It's hard to become a person when being adored is so much easier. And then there was Grandma Vera, who did not calculate, who, in a family of people keeping score, simply refused to play. Here is the thing that broke my family, though nobody ever said it out loud. When my grandfather died, Vera had the house on Linden Street, free and clear, and a small amount of money, and my mother and my uncle immediately began, in the gentlest and most poisonous way, to circle it. Not openly. My mother would never be so crude. It came out in comments. "Mom, that house is really too big for you. Mom, you should think about what happens to the house, for tax reasons. Mom, Grant's been looking at investment properties, if you ever wanted to keep it in the family." I was there for some of it. I remember one Sunday, my mother stayed for tea after dropping something off, a rare visit, and she stood in that warm kitchen and looked around it the way an appraiser looks at an estate sale. Mom," she said, stirring her tea, "this neighborhood's really come up. You could get a lot for this place. You should think about it, for your own sake. Stairs aren't getting any easier." And she smiled, like it was concern. Vera heard every word of it, that Sunday and all the others. And she did the thing she always did. She poured the tea, and she asked my mother about Grant's new job, and she changed the subject so smoothly you'd never know a thing had happened. I used to think she didn't notice. I used to feel bad for her, this sweet old woman who couldn't see how her own daughter circled her house like a hawk. I had it exactly wrong. She noticed everything. She was just, even then, already 3 moves ahead of all of us, and far too smart to let anyone see her play. I was the one who visited. I want to be careful how I say this, because it's easy to make it sound like I was a saint, and I wasn't. I visited because I liked being there. Vera's kitchen was the one place in my life where nobody was keeping score, where I didn't have to be quicker or prettier or more successful than my brother, where I could just be a person sitting at a table. I visited for me as much as for her. But I visited. Every Sunday for the last 9 years of her life, and more than that at the end. My mother visited on holidays and made sure people knew she'd visited. Grant visited when he needed Vera to co-sign something, which she stopped doing after the second time. In the last 2 years, when Vera needed help with the stairs and the shopping and the long, slow business of a body winding down, it was me, Sunday after Sunday. And I never once resented it, because those Sundays were the best hours of my week. We cooked, every Sunday. Even at the very end, when she couldn't stand at the stove for more than a few minutes, she'd sit at the kitchen table wrapped in a cardigan and direct me like a conductor. A little more salt. No, with your hands, not the spoon. Let it rest, Claire. You can't rush a rest. And while the pots did their work, she told me stories. About my grandfather, about the war, about being a young woman in a time that gave young women almost nothing and expecting her to be grateful for it anyway. And somewhere in those last 2 years, she started giving me the cards. One at a time. Not all at once. That was the thing I didn't notice. The apple cake I'd had since I was 12, but now the others, slowly. The bread one Sunday, the pot roast a month later, the Christmas cookies with the secret of the orange zest, handed over with great ceremony the week before Christmas. "This one's yours now," she'd say each time, pressing the card into my hand. "You're old enough to be trusted with it." The same words she'd used when I was 12. I thought it was just her way, a little ritual we had. I thought she was being sentimental. An old woman passing her recipes to the one grandchild who actually cooked, the one who'd carry the food forward. I took the cards home and filed them in my own box in my own kitchen, and thought nothing of it, nothing at all. I know now what she was really doing. She was emptying the top layer of that oak box, one card at a time, in front of everyone, over 2 years, so slowly that it looked like nothing, like sentiment, like an old woman's habit. She was making room in the box for what would go underneath. And she was making sure that the person who'd end up with all the cards, the person who'd notice if the box was ever empty, was the person who came on Sundays. She was building the answer to a test and quietly handing me the only pencil. There's one more afternoon I have to tell you about, because it's the only time I ever saw my grandmother angry, and I understand it completely differently now. I was about 26. We were in the kitchen and the phone rang, and it was my mother, and I could hear her voice through the receiver, tight and wheedling, doing her thing about the house, this time about a home equity loan, about how Vera could free up some of that value and help Grant with a business idea. Vera listened, said, "I'll think about it, Carol," and hung up. And then she stood at the counter with both hands flat on it, and she was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had something in it I'd never heard. "They think I don't hear them," she said. "Not to me, exactly. To the window. 60 years I've been in this house. I raised that girl in this house, and she stands in my kitchen and looks at the walls instead of at me." She was quiet again. Then she picked up her rolling pin and went back to the dough, and the moment closed, and she never spoke of it again. I thought it was just an old woman having a hard day. I know now it was the day I watched her decide something. I just couldn't see what. Vera died on a Tuesday in October. In her own bed, in the house on Linden Street, in the room she'd slept in for 50 years. With me holding her hand. It was quiet. She wasn't afraid, or if she was, she'd made her peace with it long before. The way she'd made her peace with everything, quietly and in advance. Her last words to me were not dramatic, and I'm glad, because dramatic would not have been her. Late in the afternoon, drifting, she opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "Did you feed the sourdough?" The starter, the one she'd kept alive for 30 years, that I'd been tending for her the last few months. I said, "Yes, Grandma, this morning." She nodded, satisfied, like the last item on a long list had been checked off. She said, "Good girl," and she closed her eyes. And a few hours later, with the afternoon light going gold in that room, she was gone. The last thing on her mind was whether the thing she'd kept alive for 30 years would keep living after her. I've thought about that 1,000 times since. She was still, at the very end, making sure the important things were tended. I had barely stopped crying when my mother started on the house. The body was not yet in the ground. I mean this literally. We were in the funeral home picking the casket when my mother said to the funeral director, as though it were a normal thing to say, "We'll be listing the Linden Street property, so if you know any realtors." My uncle had passed a few years before. It was just my mother and Grant now, and they had already, in the space of an afternoon, divided a house that wasn't theirs. And here's the part I didn't know yet, the part that turned out to be the hinge the whole story swung on. My mother had already, in the days between Vera's death and the funeral, quietly been to a lawyer. Of course she had. While I was feeding the sourdough and choosing a hymn, my mother was pulling the deed to the house on Linden Street, because that's who she is, and grief for her has always been just a brief inconvenience on the way to the accounting. And she'd found something that confused her. The deed didn't say what she expected. There were words on it she didn't understand, references to an arrangement, to dates from 11 years back, to Colleen's firm. She couldn't parse it. She couldn't reach Colleen before the funeral, and it made her nervous in the specific way a predator gets nervous when the ground shifts under a hunt it thought was already won. So she did what frightened grabbing people do. She grabbed harder. She decided that whatever was confusing in the deed, the answer must be in that oak box, that Vera had hidden the real paperwork, and if Carol could just get her hands on the box before anyone else, she could make the confusing thing disappear, and the house would be hers to sell after all. She had it exactly, perfectly backwards. The box was never going to fix her problem. The box was the explanation of her problem. She spent that whole funeral desperate to grab the one object in the room that was going to prove, in front of everyone, that she'd already lost. The funeral was 3 days later. The oak box came to me the way Vera planned it. She'd left instructions with the funeral home, of all places, that it was to be placed in my hands at the service by a staff member in front of everyone. I understand now that she chose that on purpose. She knew my mother. She knew that if that box changed hands in private, it would vanish. So she made sure it was handed to me in a room full of witnesses at the one event my mother couldn't skip and couldn't control. The service was at the little Methodist church Vera had gone to for 60 years. It was full. More full than my mother expected, I think, because my mother measured Vera by the yardstick of a woman who'd never done anything important, and a whole church of people who'd been fed and helped and quietly carried by that woman over 60 years told a different story. There were people there my mother didn't even recognize. Vera had a whole life my family never bothered to see. I was sitting in the second pew when a young man from the funeral home came down the aisle carrying the oak box in both hands, the way you'd carry something breakable, and set it gently on my lap. It was exactly as I remembered it. Pale, plain oak, the brass latch gone green in the corners with age. And there, in the bottom right corner, worn almost smooth by 40 years of hands, was a shaky letter C, the one I had carved there myself with a stolen paring knife when I was 8 years old, and gotten a stern talking to for, and that Vera had flatly refused to sand out. "Leave it," she'd told my grandfather when he offered to fix it. "That's the box's name now." She gave it a name. I'd forgotten that. I remembered it in that pew, with the box on my lap, and I had to press my lips together hard. I put both hands on it. The brass was cold from the October air, and that's when my mother stood up from the front pew, in her good black dress, and said, loud enough for all of them, "Hand it over, Claire. That box is estate property." You know that part. You were there for the opening. Let me tell you what happened after I told her to open it in front of everyone. For a moment, my mother didn't know what to do. She had expected me to fold. 34 years of evidence said I would fold. The quiet one, the peacekeeper, the girl who gave up her share to avoid a scene. And instead, I was sitting there with both hands on the box, in front of 80 people, inviting her to make this as public as she wanted. It was Grant who moved first, because Grant could always read a room faster than anyone. He saw, in an instant, that a screaming tug-of-war over a box at a funeral would make the two of them look like exactly what they were, in front of 80 witnesses, including half of Vera's church. So he stood, and he put his hand gently on our mother's arm, and he said, smooth as warm butter, "Mom, not here. This isn't the place." He gave the room a small, sad, apologetic smile, the grieving grandson keeping the peace. "Let's do this properly. At the house, with the lawyer, like Grandma would have wanted. Claire's not going to do anything stupid." And then he looked at me. And the look was not sad, and it was not apologetic, and it was only for me. The look said, clear as a spoken sentence, "We will get it from you later, at the house, where there are no witnesses and no church and no cameras, and you will hand it over like you always do." Grant had read the whole room correctly. He'd just misread the one person in it who mattered, the same way they always had. So we did it properly. 3 days after that, we sat in Vera's living room on Linden Street, my mother, Grant, me, and Vera's lawyer, a soft-spoken woman named Colleen, who had known my grandmother for 30 years. The oak box sat on the coffee table between us, and I want you to remember, as I tell you this, that my mother and my brother were looking at that box and seeing a container, a thing with a valuable thing inside it. They had no idea they were looking at the plan itself. Colleen opened the reading of the will the way you'd expect, small things first, and I watched my mother's face do its arithmetic on each one. Vera's wedding ring, to me, my mother's jaw tightened. Her books, to me, a small sniff. A sum of money, the liquid cash in her ordinary accounts. And here, Vera did something that surprised me at the time and that I understand completely now. She gave the bulk of that cash to my mother and Grant. Divided most of it between the two of them. I got a small share. I saw the relief flicker across my mother's face, the recalculation. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe the old woman had been sensible after all. Maybe Claire wasn't getting everything. And that was exactly what Vera wanted her to feel in that moment. I know it now. She gave my mother and Grant the visible money, the money they could see and count and understand, precisely so they'd sit still and quiet and satisfied for the 10 more minutes it took to reach the box. She paid for their patience with cash. She'd thought of everything. She always had. Then Colleen said, "There's a specific instruction regarding the recipe box." Vera was very particular. She asked that Claire open it here in front of the family and that no one else handle it first. My mother's hand twitched toward it. Grant said, "Go ahead, Claire." Both of them leaned in. I pressed the brass latch. It clicked, the way it had clicked my whole life. And inside were recipe cards, dozens of them. Vera's careful hand, butter-stained, the apple cake on top. Just recipe cards. My mother let out a breath that was half a laugh. "Recipes," she said. "She left the recipes in the fancy box." Grant actually did laugh, a short, surprised bark. "That's it? That's what the big secret was? Grandma's pot roast?" And my mother's whole body relaxed, because in that moment she was certain the confusing thing about the deed was just her imagination, and the box was just an old woman's sentiment, and she'd been worked up over nothing. "Well," my mother said, reaching for the box, "I'll take those, they're family." "No," I said, and I put my hand flat on the lid, because I knew something they didn't. I knew there was a second box. 22 years I hadn't thought about it. And then, sitting in that pew 3 days earlier with the oak on my lap and my thumb finding that carved C in the corner, it had come back to me all at once. Your grandfather had 2 of these boxes made. The other one's for the things that matter more than recipes. You'll know it when you see it, and you'll know what to do. 2 boxes from a single oak tree. And I was holding one box. But I was also, I realized, holding a C I had carved when I was 8, a letter that sat, I now saw, not in the middle of the corner panel, but right at its edge, right where a seam would be, right where, if you pressed it, a latch might click. I hadn't been able to try it at the funeral, obviously. I could barely breathe at the funeral. But I took the box home, and for 3 nights it sat on my kitchen table, and I could not stop looking at it. 2 boxes from one tree, the things that matter more than recipes. You'll know it when you see it. On the first night, I opened the top and took out all the recipe cards and laid them across my table, and I read every one, in her handwriting, and I cried until I couldn't see them. And with the box empty, I noticed for the first time that it was deeper on the outside than on the inside. Not by much, by about an inch. 40 years I'd known that box and never once measured it against itself. On the second night, I ran my thumb around the inside and then the outside, and then I found myself touching the carved C in the corner, and I realized it didn't sit in the middle of the panel the way a child's random carving would. It sat right at the edge, right on a seam I'd never noticed because the C had always drawn my eye. I pressed it. Something gave with a soft wooden click, 40 years old and still working, and the bottom of the box dropped 1/4 of an inch and slid free in my hand. There weren't 2 boxes. There had only ever been 1 box, with 2 layers. My grandmother had let me believe for 22 years that there was a second box somewhere out in the world, so that I would keep the idea alive, so that I would be looking, so that when the time came, I would be the one who thought to look inside instead of elsewhere. The carpenter made 1 box with a secret in its floor, and Vera spent my whole life making sure I'd be the one to find it. I'm going to be honest about what I did next because it matters. I looked at what was in the second layer, and then I closed it back up and I slept on it for 1 more night, because I understood something the moment I saw it. Whatever I did with this, I could only do once. If I did it alone, in my kitchen, it would become my word against theirs, a thing my mother could rewrite by morning. It had to happen in front of them, in front of the lawyer, in front of witnesses. My grandmother had taught me that without ever once saying it out loud. She'd handed me the box in a full church for a reason. Do the important thing where they can't rewrite it. So I closed the floor of the box, and I waited. So there, in Vera's living room, with my mother's hand already reaching for the stack of recipe cards, and Grant leaning back with that smirk, I put my hand flat on the lid of the box. "There's another part," I said. My mother's hand stopped. "What do you mean another part? It's a recipe box, Claire, don't be—" And I pressed the carved C in the corner. "I want you to picture it, because I'll see it for the rest of my life." The soft wooden click, 40 years old, still perfect. The false bottom dropping its 1/4 inch and sliding free in my hands. My mother's face, the exact moment her certainty cracked, when she realized the thing she'd been so sure was nothing was, in fact, something, and that I had known about it and she had not. Grant sat up straight, the smirk gone. And Colleen, who I'd only understand later had known about all of this for 11 years, who had helped Vera build it, who had been waiting in that chair to see whether the granddaughter would find the latch, Colleen quietly folded her hands in her lap. She let out a breath. The way you breathe out when a thing you've waited a very long time for finally, safely arrives. Under the recipe cards, in the second layer, there were 3 things. The first was a stack of letters, tied with kitchen twine, the same twine she trusted chicken with. Dozens of them, each one folded, each one dated in the corner in her hand. And when I saw the dates, my breath went out of me, because the oldest one was 9 years old, dated the first Sunday I ever came to visit her as an adult, the first Sunday of the 9 years. She had written me a letter after almost every single visit. For 9 years. I would drive home thinking we'd just had a nice afternoon, and she would sit down at that kitchen table after I left and write down the things she hadn't said. And there are things that generation could never say out loud, love chief among them. And she'd fold the letter and date it and put it in the box, under the false floor, where they'd wait for me. 9 years of a woman telling me she loved me in the only way she could, and saving it up, so that when she was gone I would not run out of her all at once. The second was a single sheet of paper, a letter to the whole family, which Colleen would read aloud in a moment. And the third was a small brass key taped to an index card. And on the index card, in Vera's careful hand, it said, Claire, Farmers and Merchants Bank, Box 114. You already have the other key. It's the one I gave you for the sourdough cupboard. I always kept them the same. Gee. My mother said, What bank box? There's no bank box in the estate. And Colleen said quietly, There is. It simply isn't part of the estate. It hasn't been for 11 years. Here is what my grandmother did, and here is why it took me until that living room to understand the size of it. 11 years before she died, Vera went to see Colleen. This was right around the time my mother started making comments about the house being too big, about tax reasons, about keeping it in the family. Vera heard all of it, and instead of fighting, instead of making a scene, instead of even mentioning that she'd noticed, she quietly went and made a plan. She could not stop my mother from being who she was. She'd made her peace with that, I think, a long time before. But she could decide, in advance, in cold daylight, exactly how much power my mother would have on the day it finally counted. And she decided the answer was none. Not through a trap, not through anything my family could later call a trick. Through daylight. Through doing everything correctly and legally and years early, in a place my family would never think to look, because they were all so busy looking at the house. Here is what Colleen told us, in that living room, reading from her file. 11 years before she died, right around the time my mother started talking about the neighborhood coming up, about the stairs, about keeping it in the family, Vera came into Colleen's office one afternoon, alone, having taken 2 buses to get there so no one would see her car anywhere unusual. And she set up an arrangement for the house on Linden Street, a proper one. Signed, witnessed, recorded, unshakable. It meant the house was no longer, in any legal sense, part of the estate my mother would one day try to divide. Vera had directed it, 11 years in advance, to come to me. Every requirement met, every form correct, nothing left loose for anyone to pull on. That was the confusing thing my mother's lawyer had found in the deed a week before the funeral and couldn't explain to her. The house wasn't Carol's to sell. It hadn't been for over a decade. She just didn't know it yet, and it had made her grab all the harder, because some animal part of her sensed the ground moving and didn't know why. And Box 114 at the Farmers and Merchants Bank held the rest. I'll tell you the truth about it, because the truth is better than the fairy tale where Grandma turns out to be a secret millionaire. She wasn't. What was in that box was the quiet arithmetic of a frugal woman across 60 years. Savings bonds, bought a little at a time, some cash, a modest account in her own name that my mother never knew existed. Not a fortune, but real and enough. Enough to change a life that needed changing. Enough to say, I thought about you, in the language of a generation that counted its love in dollars set aside. And it had my name on it. It had had my name on it for 11 years, arranged a decade before Vera died, while my mother made comments about the stairs and everyone stayed certain that the woman in the apron was exactly as simple as she looked. There was nothing my mother could do. It was done. She'd lost a game 11 years ago that she never knew she was playing, against an opponent she'd never once thought to take seriously. Colleen read the letter to the family out loud. I'll tell you the part that mattered. Colleen unfolded the single sheet and read it in her steady lawyer's voice, and the room went completely silent. Vera wrote that she loved us all. She did. That's the thing my mother could never understand. That Vera's clear-eyed knowledge of exactly who we each were did not cancel her love, it just made it honest. She wrote that she loved my mother especially, in the sad, helpless way you love a child who got frightened early and never quite stopped. A child who spent her whole life certain there wasn't enough. Not enough money, not enough love, not enough room. And who grabbed because of it. Carol, you were not a bad daughter, Vera wrote. You were a scared one. I wish I had known how to fix that when you were small. By the time I understood it, you were grown, and grown fear turns to habit, and I did not have the tools. She wrote that she'd known exactly how her funeral would go because she'd been watching it come for years, in every comment about the neighborhood and the stairs. She wrote that she was sorry it had come down to boxes and hidden latches and lawyers, that no one wished harder than she did that she could have simply trusted her family to be kind. But I learned a long time ago, she wrote, that the only way to protect a soft thing is to build something hard around it. This box is the hard thing. What's inside is the soft thing. I'm sorry I had to build the one to save the other. And then she wrote the line that broke the room. She wrote, I gave the recipes to Claire one at a time over 2 years, so that all of you would watch me do it and think nothing of it. I was emptying the top of the box in plain sight, so there would be room, and so the person who noticed the box was empty would be the person who loved the box and not the money. Carol, you never once asked about the box. Claire carved her name in it when she was 8. That is the whole story of my family, and I knew it before any of you did. Nobody said anything for a long moment after Colleen finished. The only sound was the old clock on Vera's mantel, the one that had ticked through every Sunday of my life. My mother's face had gone very still, in a way I'd never seen. Not angry for once, just stopped, like a machine that had hit something it couldn't process. And Grant, I'll give my brother this one thing, the only thing, but it's real. Grant looked at me, and then he looked at the stack of letters tied in kitchen twine on the coffee table. 9 years of letters our grandmother had written to the granddaughter who showed up on Sundays, and something moved across his face that I had never seen there in 38 years. Not anger, not calculation, something slower and worse. I think it was the first true understanding, arriving far too late, of what he'd traded away. A lifetime of being adored for nothing. He'd been the favorite. He'd gotten the candles and the credit and the soft landings, and Vera had written 9 years of letters to me. There were no letters for Grant in that box. Not because Vera didn't love him, she did, but because Grant had never once given her 9 years of Sundays to write about. You cannot save up a love that was never spent. He understood that, I think, in that living room. I watched it land on him. He hasn't been quite the same since, and I don't say that with any satisfaction. It's just true. The aftermath. 3 things: the practical, the painful, and the one that healed. The practical. There was, in the end, nothing to fight, and that was the entire genius of what my grandmother did. My mother did what my mother would always do. She took the deed to her lawyer a second time and demanded he find a way. And he told her, again, what she hadn't been able to hear the first time. It was airtight. It was 11 years old. Every signature was in place, every witness accounted for, every form correct, filed by a lawyer who documented everything precisely because she knew this day would come. You cannot overturn a woman's clear, careful, legally perfect decision about her own house, made a full decade before her death, in sound mind. It simply cannot be done. My mother had spent the afternoon of her own mother's death dividing up a house that had not, in any real legal sense, belonged to the estate for 11 years. Everything she'd done, the comments about the neighborhood, the visit to the lawyer, the reach for the box at the funeral, the whole grasping performance, had been theater staged over a decision that was already, quietly, permanently final before it even began. Vera had beaten her by more than a decade. And the reason my mother never saw it coming is the truest, saddest thing in this whole story. You cannot see the move of a person you've decided isn't worth watching. My mother had spent 30 years being certain Vera was a simple old woman in an apron. That certainty was the exact blind spot Vera used to walk right past her. The underestimation wasn't just my mother's cruelty, it was her defeat. And everyone in that room understood it at the same moment she did, that the woman she'd spent 30 years talking over had quietly outthought her by more than a decade, in front of witnesses, with nothing left to argue. She didn't lose loudly. She lost completely. in a silence that everyone in Vera's living room could hear, the painful. My mother and I are not close now. We were never going to be, and I want to be clear that the boxes didn't cause that. They only turned the lights on in a house that had been dark for 34 years. She said some things, in that living room and in the weeks after, that I'd manipulated a confused old woman. That the Sunday visits were a long con, a 9-year investment with a payoff I'd been calculating all along. That I'd always been sly underneath all that quiet. I let her say them. I didn't defend myself, and not because I'm a saint. I've got no halo in this story, but because I understood something watching her face as she said it. She had to believe I'd stolen something. She had to, because the only other explanation was unbearable. That she had been given the exact same thing I was given. The same open door, the same 9 years of Sundays, the same warm kitchen, and the same grandmother who would have loved nothing more than her scared daughter walking in and sitting down and just being fed. My mother had all of that available to her, every single week, for free. And she'd been too busy circling the house to ever once walk into it. That's not a theft. There's no villain who took it from her. That's just a grief with no bottom. The worst kind there is, the kind you did to yourself. And so she needed me to be a thief, because a thief is easier to live with than that. I let her have it. I don't hate my mother. I looked at her across that room, and what I felt, to my own surprise, was something close to what Vera must have felt for 40 years. A kind of sorrow for a frightened person who was standing in a warm house insisting she was cold. I just finally, at 34, stopped waiting for her to become someone she had shown me my entire life she was never going to be. And the thing that healed. The letters. 9 years of them, tied in kitchen twine. I made a decision about them the first week, and I've kept it. I read 1 letter a week, on Sundays, at my own kitchen table, with a cup of her coffee made her way, in the exact order she wrote them. 1 a week. Which means the letters will last me 9 years. She wrote 9 years of Sundays, and I'll read 9 years of Sundays. And I think she planned that too. I think she knew exactly what she was doing, making sure I couldn't gulp her all down in one grieving night and then have nothing. She rationed herself out to me, the way she'd rationed the recipe cards. So I'd never quite run out of her. I'm 3 years into the 9 now. She tells me about her day, about the weather, about my grandfather and the 50 years of small mornings with him. She tells me things she was proud of and things she still regretted at 80. She is, in these letters, funnier and sadder and more whole than my family ever let her be in life. And in one of them, from the 2nd year, an ordinary Sunday in spring, she wrote something I've read so many times I know it by heart. You think you come here for me. You don't, quite, and that's all right. You come here because this is the one place in your life where you get to be exactly who you are, and nobody hands you a bill for it afterward. I know that feeling. I spent my whole life looking for a room like that, and when I couldn't find one, I built one, and I made sure the coffee was always on. That's what I want to leave you. Not the house, though you'll have the house, the feeling of the house. Someday, build a kitchen like this for someone who needs one. That's the only recipe that really matters, and it's the one I never wrote on a card, because you already know it by heart. I have the house on Linden Street now. I didn't sell it. I cook in that kitchen every Sunday. The recipe box sits next to the flower with the daisy on it, and the herbs are back on the windowsill in their coffee cans. And the oak box, the one with 2 layers, the one with my crooked childhood C carved in the corner, sits on the shelf where I can see it, empty now, its work finally done. So that's the story. A woman in an apron who everyone underestimated, and who quietly spent 11 years making sure that the one person who ever really saw her would be protected long after she was gone. A pile of recipe cards that a whole family laughed at, and a false bottom, in a box carved by a carpenter 40 years ago, that held a plan more patient than anything my scheming family ever managed. If you've ever been the one who showed up, the one who visited, who answered the phone at 2 a.m., who sat at the bedside doing the unglamorous work while everyone else was somewhere counting the silverware, I want you to hear this from someone who lived it and who didn't understand until it was almost too late what she was being given. They are watching, far more carefully than you know. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the women in the aprons who pour the tea and change the subject and let themselves be talked over at their own tables. They see everything. They always did. They see who circles the house and who does the dishes. They see who shows up for the money and who shows up for the person. They keep a record you can't see, in a language your scheming relatives never bothered to learn. And every so often, if you're very lucky, one of them decides to act. Quietly, years in advance. In secret, with 2 bus rides and a lawyer and a false-bottomed box. To make absolutely certain that in the end, showing up was the thing that counted. It will not always be a box. It won't always be money or a house. But there is almost always something left someone by someone who noticed. Love, the real kind, the quiet kind, the kind that gets overlooked precisely because it never demands anything, has a long memory and a way of planning ahead. Last Sunday, a young woman from down the street knocked on my door, new to town, no family here, and she'd smelled the bread. I don't even know how the smell got that far. I sat her down at Vera's table, in Vera's kitchen, and I fed her, and I didn't send her a bill for it. When she left, she asked, a little shy, if she could come back next Sunday. I said, of course, the coffee's always on. And standing in that doorway watching her go, I finally understood the thing my grandmother told me when I was 12. There was never a second box out in the world. The second box was this: a warm kitchen and an open door and a person who shows up, passed from her hands to mine, and now from mine to a stranger's. I'd inherit, not the house, the thing that happens inside it. Show up for the people who show up, and when you can, be the warm kitchen for someone who needs one. There's a new confession here every day, and I'll see you in the next one.